She began as an actress in a filthy theater, the daughter of a circus bear keeper. She would become the most powerful woman in the world. But when her own city rose up in flames against her, and her husband the emperor was ready to flee for his life, she revealed her true nature. She locked the palace gates, refused to run, and ordered the massacre of 30,000 rebels in a single afternoon. Her throne wasn't given, it was bought with blood. The city smelled of cinnamon, frankincense, and filth. On the boards of a grimy theater, a supple body moved beneath the roar of the crowd. Theodora, daughter of a bear keeper, knew the price of admiring glances and tossed coins. She did not merely dance, she offered the audience a promise, an illusion of accessibility that she never intended to fulfill, a fantasy spun from sweat and flickering lamplight. Every gesture, every turn of her head, was calibrated with cold precision. She moved through the thick, smoky air as if it were water, her limbs weaving a story of pliable desire that was not her own. The men leaned forward, their faces a blur of avarice and longing, seeing in her a vessel for their own crude fantasies. She allowed them this, for their delusion was her currency, each leering eye a stepping stone out of the gutter. Behind the curtain, in the dim light of oil lamps, she washed away not only the paint but also the desires of others, leaving only the hardness in her dark eyes. The cold water was a relief, a baptism that returned her to herself. She scrubbed her skin raw, erasing the lingering touch of 1,000 gazes, peeling back the performer to reveal the strategist beneath, the woman who existed only for herself when no one was watching. Her beauty was a weapon, and her intellect was armor. She had learned early that the world would try to claim her body, so she had sharpened her mind into a blade. While other women learned to weave or sing, she learned to read the subtle shifts in a man's expression, to understand the unspoken language of power, ambition, and, most importantly, weakness. Every man had a weakness, a crack in his facade. She was learning to see them all. The stage was merely her training ground. Each night was a lesson in manipulation, a study of the human animal in its most primal state. She saw the wealthy merchant, the drunken soldier, the grasping politician, and in each of them, she saw a lock to be picked, a path to be exploited. They thought they were watching her, judging her performance, but it was she who was truly observing them, gathering intelligence for a war only she knew she was fighting. In this city of marble and mud, she was a nobody, a fleeting pleasure for men who would forget her name by morning. But as she stared at her own reflection in a shard of polished metal, a silent vow took root in the core of her being. She would not be forgotten. This city, this empire, would learn her name and speak it with reverence or with fear. It did not matter which, so long as they spoke it. The anonymity of her current life was a temporary shroud she would soon cast off. Her memory drifted to her father, a man who understood beasts better than he understood his own children. He worked for the Greens, one of the great racing factions, and the stench of the bear cages still clung to her memory. He had taught her that every creature, no matter how ferocious, could be tamed with the right application of fear and reward. She saw little difference between the bears in the hippodrome and the men in the theater. Both responded to spectacle and dominance. The applause was a physical thing, a wave of noise that washed over her but did not touch her. It was the sound of a successful transaction. She had given them a performance, and they had given her their attention and their coins. She gathered the small bronze pieces from the stage, her movements efficient and devoid of the grace she had displayed moments before. This was business. The art was merely the packaging for the commerce of survival. Back in the cramped, damp space that served as her dressing room, the illusion shattered completely. The glamour of the stage was a lie contradicted by the peeling plaster and the single rickety stool. Here, she was not the object of 1,000 desires, but a young woman rinsing the sweat and grime from her aching limbs in a bucket of cold water. The transition was jarring, a fall from a fabricated heaven to a very real earth. She thought of her sisters, Anastasia and Comito, who shared this life with her. They embraced the fleeting adoration, finding warmth in the applause. They mistook the lust of the crowd for a form of love. Theodora saw it for what it was, a hunger that could never be satisfied, a fire that would consume them if they stood too close. She loved them, but she saw their softness as a fatal flaw in a city built on stone and ambition. Her ambition was a cold, hard thing, a kernel of ice in her chest that the city's heat could not melt. It had been forged in poverty, shaped by the casual cruelty of the powerful and the desperation of the powerless. She had felt what it was to be helpless, to be dependent on the whims of others. She had sworn to herself that she would never feel that way again. She would be the one whose whims mattered. As she dressed in her own simple tunic, the elaborate costume of the dancer folded away like a shed skin, she felt herself solidifying. The ethereal creature from the stage was gone, replaced by a woman of flesh, blood, and unyielding will. The city outside roared, a constant hum of life and death, of fortunes made and lives ruined in the turning of a day. It was a monster, and she intended to climb onto its back. She slipped out through a side alley, merging with the anonymous crowds flowing through the city's arteries. Without the paint and the silks, no one gave her a second glance. This invisibility was its own form of power, allowing her to move and observe freely. She walked past the great forums and the towering aqueducts, her gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the great palace against the bruised twilight sky. That was her stage. Not the dusty boards of a cheap theater, but the center of the world, the heart of the empire. The men who ruled from that palace thought themselves gods, remote and untouchable. They did not see the hunger in the eyes of a girl from the gutters. They could not imagine that one day she would walk those marble halls not as a petitioner or a servant, but as their equal. As their master. Her path was unwritten, but its destination was certain. The years of wandering had ended. Theodora had returned from the cities of the East, from Alexandria and Antioch, not defeated, but refined. She had seen the breadth of the empire, its deserts and its ports, and the experience had burned away the last of her youthful softness, leaving a core of tempered steel. She now lived in a modest dwelling, far from the theater district, a place of quiet anonymity. Here, she was not a performer, but a woman engaged in the simple, ancient act of spinning wool. The repetitive motion of the spindle soothed a part of her, a quiet rhythm beneath the constant storm of her thoughts and ambitions. It was there that the heir to the throne, Justinian, first saw her. He was passing through the narrow street, a man of 40 years, his mind occupied with matters of state, of armies on the frontier and intrigues in the palace. His gaze, accustomed to scanning crowds for threats or supplicants, was drawn to a window. Through the frame, he saw not just a woman, but a composition of profound stillness. The afternoon light illuminated the focused line of her jaw, the deliberate and efficient movement of her hands. She was not merely spinning wool, she was commanding it, transforming raw material into a perfect, ordered thread. He, a man accustomed to the calculated graces of court ladies, was struck by the raw honesty of the scene. There was no artifice in her posture, no performance for an unseen audience. He saw a will as strong and as taut as the thread she was spinning. In that moment, he understood that her beauty was the least interesting thing about her. Theodora felt the weight of his stare. It was different from the hungry, anonymous gazes of the theater. This was a look of assessment, of recognition. She did not falter in her work, her hands moving with the same steady rhythm. After a moment, she slowly raised her head, her dark eyes meeting his across the street. There was no fear in her gaze, no coy submission. There was only a calm, unwavering acknowledgement. In that shared look, a silent transaction occurred. He saw the empress she could be, and she saw the emperor he was, recognizing the path to her destiny standing before her in the dusty street. Their subsequent meetings were clandestine at first, conversations held in shadowed gardens and borrowed rooms. He discovered the mind he had only glimpsed in that first glance. She spoke of the provinces not as territories on a map, but as living places with unique grievances and desires. She understood the populace in a way no patrician ever could. Justinian, the seasoned politician, found himself captivated. He had spent his life surrounded by men who told him what they thought he wanted to hear. She told him the truth as she saw it, her words sharp and unvarnished. He did not see a courtesan, he saw a counselor, a strategist, a partner. He saw in her a kindred spirit, a soul forged in the disparate fires of ambition. His ambition was for the empire, for a restored Rome. Hers was for herself, a relentless drive to escape the fate prescribed for her. He realized that their ambitions were not in conflict, they could be intertwined, each strengthening the other. The decision was made in his mind, absolute and irrevocable. He would make her his wife. The declaration was met with shock, then with derision and outrage within the palace walls. The aristocracy, the Senate, his own family, they saw only the actress, the daughter of a bear keeper, the scandal. A formidable obstacle stood in his way, the ancient law, a pillar of Roman tradition, which forbade a man of senatorial rank from marrying a woman from the stage. To the court, the law was sacred. To Justinian, it was merely an inconvenience, a rule written for a world that did not contain Theodora. The Empress Euphemia, his aunt, was his most vocal opponent. A woman of rigid principles and humble origins herself, she could not abide the elevation of a courtesan. Her disapproval was a cold and constant pressure, a reminder of the established order he sought to defy. But Justinian's will was a force of nature. He began the slow, arduous process of dismantling the law. He lobbied senators, he made promises, he issued threats veiled in diplomatic language. He was not asking for permission, he was informing them of a future that was already decided. His devotion was a political weapon. Theodora watched this battle from a distance, a silent partner in her own ascension. She knew that her future depended on his victory. She offered him counsel, her sharp insights into the motivations of his enemies proving invaluable. She was already acting as his empress, long before she wore the title. Eventually, the old empress died, and with her, the most significant bastion of resistance crumbled. The law was amended. The path was cleared. The city held its breath. The heir to the world's greatest empire was to marry a woman who had once danced for throne coins. In the year 525, inside the vast, golden expanse of the Hagia Sophia, the ceremony took place. Theodora walked towards the altar, no longer the creature of the stage, but a figure of immense and formidable grace. The light from the high windows seemed to bend towards her. She was draped in Tyrian purple, the color of emperors, a color she had only ever dreamed of. The scent of incense replaced the memory of sweat and cheap perfume. The sound of sacred chants replaced the roar of the drunken mob. This was the culmination of her vow, the first great victory. As she took Justinian's hand, she felt not the fluttering of a bride, but the firm resolve of a monarch securing an alliance. She was not just gaining a husband, she was gaining a throne, a platform from which her will could reshape the world. The power she had craved was now within her grasp. The following 2 years were a period of quiet consolidation. She was now Patricia, a woman of noble rank, but she was not idle. She studied the complex machinery of the court, learning the names, the allegiances, and the secrets of every significant figure. She built her own network of loyal agents, her eyes and ears throughout the palace and the city. She proved to Justinian daily that his faith in her was not misplaced. She was his most trusted advisor, his confidant in all matters. Her judgment was sound, her instincts unerring. She understood power not as an abstraction, but as a practical tool, something to be wielded with precision and without sentiment. Then, in the year 527, the old Emperor Justin died. The throne was theirs. Once more, they stood in the Hagia Sophia, the heart of the empire, before the patriarch and the assembled nobility of the realm. The city waited, the great populace filling the squares outside. This time, it was not for a wedding, but for a coronation. The air was thick with the weight of history and destiny. The sacred crowns, heavy with gold and jewels and centuries of power, were brought forth. One was for Justinian, the new Augustus, the emperor of the Romans. But a second crown was presented, one of equal splendor. It was for her. Justinian himself placed it upon her head. This was his ultimate statement to the world, a refutation of all his critics. She was not to be a mere consort, a silent figure one step behind him. The patriarch anointed her. The crowd roared its acclamation. She was Theodora, Augusta, Empress. She had ascended not as a pliant spouse, but as a co-ruler, an equal sovereign. Her will was now fused with the will of the empire itself. She had risen from the filth of the theater to the most powerful throne on earth, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that this was not the end of her journey, but the true beginning. Constantinople was boiling. The city, the heart of the world, had developed a fever that was fast approaching delirium. The ancient hatred between the demes of the Hippodrome, the Blues, and the Greens, had finally metastasized, spilling from the stands of the great arena onto the marble-paved streets. It was a rivalry as old as the city itself, a proxy war fought with colors and chants. But now, the fuel for this fire was new and potent. The crushing weight of Justinian's taxes, levied to pay for his ambitious wars and grand constructions, had united the factions in shared misery. The people felt the squeeze of the state, personified by the ruthlessness of officials like John the Cappadocian and the legalistic pedantry of Tribonian. The city had become a battlefield. The intricate web of streets, usually bustling with commerce and 1,000 languages, now echoed with the clash of iron and the screams of the dying. What had begun with a few arrests and a botched execution had transformed into a full-scale insurrection. The chant that rose above the chaos was no longer for a specific team, it was Nika. Conquer. A tide of humanity, a single monstrous entity born of rage, surged through the Misi, the city's main artery. They were a faceless mob, their individual grievances dissolved into a collective, indiscriminate fury. Yesterday, these same throats had shouted praises to their emperor and empress as they passed in procession. Today, they bayed for their heads. The symbols of imperial power were the first to fall. The Praetorium was set ablaze, its records turning to ash. The great public baths, gifts from past emperors, were stormed and vandalized. Statues of bronze and marble, crafted to immortalize the great rulers of the past, were toppled from their pedestals and smashed to pieces on the stones below. Inside the labyrinthine corridors of the great palace, Theodora was a point of absolute stillness in a universe of chaos. She stood at a high window, a casement of polished horn that looked out over the city. She could see the plumes of black smoke rising from a dozen different districts, dark pillars marking the pyres of her husband's authority. Her face was as serene and unreadable as the marble effigies that were currently being desecrated in the city squares. Servants and courtiers scurried past her, their faces pale with terror, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. She paid them no mind. Her attention was fixed on the spectacle of her capital consuming itself. She felt the intricate threads of power, which she had so carefully woven and held in her hands for 5 years, begin to fray and slip. The control she had fought so hard to attain was dissolving like salt in water. Yet, what she felt was not the cold touch of fear. It was the slow, rising heat of a pure and terrible rage. This was not an abstract political crisis. This was a personal affront. This mob, this collection of merchants, artisans, and thugs she knew so well, was trying to drag her back down into the chaos from which she had risen. They sought to strip her of the purple robes and throw her back onto the dirty stage. It was an act she would not permit. Justinian was in the council chambers, surrounded by his generals and senators. Theodora could hear the faint murmur of their panicked debate even from her position in the gallery. They were weak, she knew. Their wealth and status had insulated them from the realities of the street. They did not understand the beast that was currently clawing at the palace gates. The roar of the crowd was a physical presence now, a constant, low-frequency tremor that vibrated through the stone floors of the palace. It was the sound of thousands of voices joined in a single, hateful chorus. Intermittently, the deeper thud of a battering ram against one of the outer gates punctuated the din. They were no longer just rioting, they were laying siege. Theodora thought of her life before this, the years of smiling for men she despised, of using her body as a shield and a ladder. She had endured the contempt of the powerful and the casual cruelty of the mob. She had climbed out of that pit, clawing her way up with her fingernails. She would sooner burn with the palace than be dragged back down. A courtier, his face streaked with sweat, ran to her, babbling about the mob proclaiming a new emperor. They had found one of the nephews of the late Emperor Anastasius, a man named Hypatius, and were carrying him on a shield towards the hippodrome for a makeshift coronation. The threat was no longer amorphous, it now had a name and a face. This news changed the texture of the rebellion. It was no longer a riot, it was a revolution, a direct attempt to usurp the throne. The senators in the council room would now be weighing their options, their loyalty a commodity to be sold to the winning side. She knew how their minds worked, always calculating, always hedging their bets. She walked away from the window, her silk slippers making no sound on the mosaic floors. She moved towards the council chambers, her posture erect, her expression unyielding. The guards at the door, their faces grim and strained, parted before her without a word. She was the empress, and in the midst of this chaos, her authority seemed not diminished, but strangely amplified. She entered the chamber to a scene of utter disarray. Justinian sat at the head of the great table, his face ashen. He looked defeated, overwhelmed. His generals, Belisarius and Mundus, stood grimly to one side, awaiting orders that did not come. The senators were arguing amongst themselves, their voices shrill with fear and opportunism. One old patrician was openly advocating for flight. He spoke of ships waiting in the private harbor, of the imperial treasury being loaded, of escaping to fight another day. It was a coward's logic, dressed in the language of strategic retreat. Theodora saw several other heads nodding in agreement. They were ready to abandon the city. Justinian listened to this, his gaze distant. He had always been a man of action, a legislator, a builder. He understood the orderly processes of law and bureaucracy. He did not understand this raw, elemental fury. He saw his great project, the restoration of the empire, turning to ash before his eyes, and it was breaking him. Theodora stood silently at the edge of the room, observing. She let them talk, her eyes moving from face to face, assessing, judging. She was not listening to their words, but to the fear beneath them. She saw the foundation of their power, which they had always taken for granted, cracking beneath their feet, and they did not know what to do. Her gaze fell upon her husband. She saw the men she had chosen, the instrument of her ascension, wavering on the precipice of abdication. His indecision was more dangerous than the mob outside. A leader's fear is contagious, a plague that can destroy an empire faster than any army. She knew that if he faltered, all was lost. She felt a strange clarity descend upon her. The noise of the riot, the panicked voices in the room, it all faded into a distant hum. In that moment, she was no longer the empress, no longer Justinian's wife. She was Theodora, the daughter of the bear keeper, the survivor from the gutters, the woman who had sworn a vow to herself in the darkness. The fear of the mob was an old, familiar thing to her. But she had learned long ago that the mob was a beast that fed on fear. To show it fear was to invite it to devour you. The only way to face it was with a will colder and more ruthless than its own collective rage. She would not run. This palace was her stage now, and she would not be chased off it. The January day was bleeding away, the light through the high windows stained the color of rust by the smoke. Inside the council room of the great palace, the air was stale with the scent of fear. This was the 5th day of the siege, the 18th day of the month in the year 532, the day the world was ending. The advisors, their silken robes seeming like foolish costumes in the face of annihilation, spoke in hurried, desperate tones. They urged retreat, their arguments a chorus of well-reasoned cowardice. The ships were ready, swaying at the docks of the private imperial harbor, a fleet of ghosts waiting to carry them away from the inferno their city had become. John the Cappadocian, a man whose arrogance was usually a force of nature, was now deflated and pale. He spoke of the treasury, the vast wealth of the empire, already loaded into the holds of the warships. He argued that their lives were the true treasure, that from a safe port in Heraclea they could regroup, raise new armies, and one day return. The logic was sound, seductive in its pragmatism. To stay was to face certain, ignominious death at the hands of a frenzied mob. To flee was to preserve the principle of the empire, if not its current territory. It was a strategic withdrawal, not a defeat. They were framing their terror as a tactic, a way to save face while they saved their own skins. Justinian, emperor of the Romans, sat slumped in his high-backed chair. He was a man hollowed out, his spirit broken. The city he had dreamed of rebuilding in marble and gold was being torn apart stone by stone. The laws he had painstakingly codified were being trampled underfoot by the very people they were meant to govern. He looked like a man who had seen his own ghost. He listened to the council's advice, his gaze fixed on a map of the Mediterranean spread across the table. He was looking at the escape routes, his mind already aboard one of the waiting ships. He was no longer the Augustus, the legislator, the conqueror. He was just a man, cornered and terrified, on the verge of giving the order that would seal his legacy as the emperor who ran. His hand reached for a stylus, to sign the decree of abandonment. The room fell into a tense silence, the only sounds the crackle of the distant fires and the ceaseless, monstrous roar of the mob. This was the moment of abdication, the quiet, final surrender of an empire not to a foreign army, but to its own people. But then Theodora moved. She had been standing in the shadows, a silent observer to this council of fear. She stepped forward into the smoky light, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every man in the room. She did not look at the generals or the advisors. Her eyes were fixed on her husband. She did not shout. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, and carried a weight that shamed the panicked tones that had filled the chamber moments before. It was not the voice of an empress in distress, nor of a frightened woman. It was the voice of a ruler who had weighed the world and found her place in it. She began by addressing the very idea of flight, not as a strategy, but as an impossibility. She reminded them that to be born into the world was a certainty, but to escape death was not. The nature of their current crisis, she implied, was no different from the fundamental condition of being human. Running was a temporary delusion. Her gaze swept across the faces of the senators, men who had once scorned her for her past. She saw them for what they were, men who had inherited their power, who had never had to fight for it, and who did not understand its true price. Her life had been a constant battle, and she had never once considered retreat an option. She spoke of her own journey, not in detail, but as a stark contrast to theirs. She, who had come from nothing, would not now willingly return to the status of a fugitive. To have held the ultimate power, to have worn the imperial purple, and then to cast it aside to live as a hunted exile was a fate worse than any death. Then, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute conviction, she delivered the words that would echo through history. She stated that she would not be separated from the purple. She looked directly at her husband, at the broken man contemplating his own survival, and she offered him a different definition of victory. For her part, she said, she held to an old saying. The royal purple is the noblest shroud. The words fell into the terrified silence of the room, each one a perfectly weighted stone. It was a statement of profound and terrifying finality. It was an embrace of destiny, a rejection of cowardly hope. The meaning was unmistakable. To die here, now, as the Empress of the Romans, was a greater thing than to live for another 20 years as a forgotten refugee. The throne was not just a seat of power, it was a stage for a worthy death. The purple was not just a cloth, it was a symbol that gave meaning to both life and its end. Her speech was a mirror, and in it, the men saw their own fear reflected back as shame. The generals, Belisarius and Mundus, men of war who had been standing by for the order to retreat, visibly straightened. Their hands went to the hilts of their swords. She had reminded them of their honor, of the oaths they had sworn. Justinian looked up at his wife. In her eyes, he did not see fear or despair. He saw the same unyielding will that had captivated him in the window of a modest house years ago. Her strength was a fire, and he felt it rekindle the dying embers of his own courage. He was the emperor, and he had forgotten what that meant. She had made him remember. He pushed the decree away from him and slowly, deliberately, stood up. The stoop of defeat was gone from his shoulders. He looked at Belisarius, then at Mundus. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the whisper of a beaten man, but the clear, sharp command of a sovereign. The plan for evacuation was cancelled. The decision was made. They would stay. They would fight. They would either crush this rebellion or they would all die here, in the palace, cloaked in the imperial purple. There was no other option. A new energy, cold and hard and desperate, filled the room. The debate was over. The war had begun. Justinian gave the final order, his voice echoing the finality of Theodora's speech. The gates of the palace were to be barred. Not against the enemy, but against themselves. There would be no escape. No retreat. They were sealing themselves inside their fortress, committing themselves to victory or oblivion. A moment later, the deep, groaning sound of massive iron bolts and wooden beams sliding into place reverberated through the palace. It was a sound of absolute commitment, the sound of a door being slammed shut on the possibility of survival in favor of the necessity of rule. The gates were locked from the inside. The order was given. The general, Belisarius, received it not in the chaos of a panicked council, but in the cold silence that followed a final decision. There was no room for debate or moral ambiguity. His instructions were a model of brutal simplicity: proceed to the hippodrome and end the rebellion. Permanently. He did not flinch. This was the world he understood. The emperor commanded, and he was the instrument of that command, a sword in the hand of the state. He gathered his personal guard, a corps of battle-hardened veterans, men who had followed him across the Persian frontier and back. They were not city guards, they were killers. Another general, Mundus, was tasked with a similar force of Herulian mercenaries. These men fought for gold, not for loyalty, and they were notoriously savage. The two forces would act as pincers, two jaws of a trap closing on the unsuspecting heart of the insurrection. The city itself would become a weapon. The plan was simple, relying on the rebels' own arrogance. They had gathered in one place, a vast stone bowl from which there were few exits. They believed they were celebrating a victory, anointing a new emperor. They had, in their hubris, built their own tomb and locked themselves inside. While the city seethed, Belisarius's troops moved with unnatural quiet through the colonnades and back passages connecting the palace to the hippodrome. They were ghosts in the afternoon light, their armor muffled, their steps measured. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic roar of the crowd they were about to annihilate. Inside the hippodrome, the scene was one of delirious anarchy. The vast arena, designed for the controlled violence of chariot races, was now filled with the chaotic energy of a revolution. The mob, numbering in the tens of thousands, was a single, sweating, screaming organism. They had found their new emperor, and they were adoring him. Hypatius, nephew of the former emperor, sat uneasily in the kathisma, the imperial box. He had been found hiding in his home and dragged here against his will. The purple robe felt like a shroud on his shoulders. The cheers of the mob that proclaimed him Augustus sounded to him like the howling of wolves. He was their puppet, and he knew it. They were drunk on their newfound power, chanting Nika, until their throats were raw. They believed Justinian had already fled, that the city was theirs. The gates to the hippodrome were open, a symbol of their victory, allowing more and more citizens to pour in and witness the birth of a new, chaotic era. Belisarius reached the western entrance, the Gate of the Blues. He looked at his men, their faces grim and impassive. They were professionals. Across the arena, Mundus and his mercenaries had secured the Gate of the Dead, a name that would soon prove horribly apparent. They waited for the signal. The trap was set. The signal was given. Not with a trumpet blast, but with a sudden, coordinated movement. The great gates did not burst open, they were slammed shut. The heavy sound of iron bars dropping into stone slots was lost in the din of the celebration, but for those near the exits, it was the first note of a death sentence. Then, from multiple entrances at once, the soldiers appeared. They did not charge in a wild rush. They advanced in disciplined, silent formations, their shields locked, their spears leveled. They were a wall of polished steel and grim purpose moving into a disorganized sea of humanity. The contrast was absolute. For a moment, the crowd was merely confused. The celebration faltered. The chants died in their throats. They saw the soldiers, but their wine-addled minds could not process the threat. They thought, perhaps, this was a defection, the army joining their cause. It was the last hopeful thought many of them would ever have. The first screams came from the front ranks. The legionaries did not break formation. They simply walked forward, a methodical advance that was more terrifying than a frantic charge. Their spears thrust out from behind the wall of shields, piercing flesh, and then retracting, ready for the next victim. Panic erupted. The confusion curdled into pure, animal terror. The vast crowd, a moment before a unified body of triumphant rebellion, shattered into thousands of terrified individuals, each one desperate to escape. They surged away from the advancing soldiers, trampling their own in a frantic stampede. But there was nowhere to go. The gates were barred. The high, sheer marble walls of the arena, which they had scaled in celebration, were now insurmountable barriers. The hippodrome, the city's playground, had become a perfectly designed killing box. The architects of the arena had unwittingly designed an abattoir. The massacre began in earnest. Belisarius's legionaries were efficient, driving the crowd towards the center of the arena. Mundus's Herulians were more savage. They waded into the terrified masses, their long swords swinging, cutting down men, women, and children with gleeful brutality. They were being paid to kill, and they were earning their gold. The sounds inside the hippodrome became the sounds of hell. The exultant roar of Nika was replaced by a single, high-pitched shriek of collective agony. The cries of pain, the pleas for mercy, the death rattles, they all blended together, a symphony of slaughter that could be heard for miles. The arena floor, usually packed sand to absorb the blood of injured horses, was now soaked in human blood. It turned to a slick, red mud. People slipped and fell, only to be crushed by the press of bodies behind them or dispatched by the methodical steel of the soldiers. Resistance was futile, disorganized, and pathetic. The scene on the tiered marble seating was no different. The soldiers worked their way up the levels, cornering groups of people, ending them without hesitation. The beautiful mosaics and statues that adorned the structure became silent witnesses to the butchery, their impassive stone faces splattered with blood. As the afternoon wore on, the killing became less of a battle and more of an industrial process. The screams lessened as the number of living dwindled. The soldiers, their arms aching, moved through piles of corpses to find the last pockets of the living, hidden in terror beneath the seats or feigning death among their friends. By evening, it was over. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the hippodrome, broken only by the groans of the dying. The setting sun cast long, dark shadows across the arena, its red light glinting off the pools of blood. The air was thick and metallic with the smell of death. 30,000 bodies lay sprawled across the stands and the field. From her window in the great palace, Theodora watched the bloody sunset paint the smoke-filled sky. She could not hear the individual screams, but she had felt the rebellion's heartbeat cease, the great roar of the city silenced and replaced by something else. She knew the price had been paid. The debt of her authority had been settled in blood. The authority they had almost lost was now absolute, forged anew in the crucible of the massacre. The city was cowed, broken, silent. The survivors would never again dare to chant Nika in the presence of their rulers. Power had been restored. Her throne, once threatened, was now secure, washed clean in the blood of her subjects. The silence that fell upon Constantinople after the massacre was not one of peace, but of profound and terrible submission. The Nika revolt was over, its final, bloody chapter written in the hippodrome. From the ashes of the burned city and the graves of 30,000 of its citizens, a new order was born, absolute and unquestioned. Years passed. The scars on the city were covered over with new marble and gold, grander than before. On the ruins of the old basilica, a new Hagia Sophia began to rise, a testament not to God alone, but to the unshakable power of the rulers who had brought the city to its knees and then raised it up again. The empire, under their joint command, entered a golden age. Belisarius's armies reconquered the lost provinces of the west, bringing Africa and Italy back into the Roman fold. Justinian's laws, the great Corpus Juris Civilis, brought order and reason to 1,000 years of jurisprudence. And through it all, Theodora's influence was a constant, steadying hand, a whisper in her husband's ear that was as potent as any royal decree. She was no mere consort. She was a co-ruler in fact as well as in name. Her name appeared alongside his on all official acts. She championed laws that protected the vulnerable, the women sold into prostitution from which she herself had escaped, the actresses whose status she knew so well. She gave wives property rights and daughters inheritance. She built convents for former prostitutes. Her court was a center of power in its own right, a place of sharp intellect and unwavering will. She never forgot the lessons of the stage or the street. She understood the motivations of men better than they understood themselves, and she used this knowledge to navigate the treacherous currents of the palace with a skill that bordered on clairvoyance. Their partnership was the bedrock of the empire. Justinian was the grand dreamer, the man who saw the empire as it should be. Theodora was the pragmatist, the woman who saw the world as it was. He was the architect of the grand vision, she was the engineer who understood the stresses and strains of the foundation. They were two halves of a single, formidable sovereign. The memory of the Nika riots faded, becoming less a historical event and more a foundational myth, a chilling bedtime story the city told itself about the price of disobedience. The fear remained, a permanent subtext to the prosperity, a reminder that the hand that built the aqueducts was the same hand that had wielded the sword in the hippodrome. They grew older together. The fires of their youth banked into the steady, warm glow of a long and complex partnership. They had faced down the world and won. In the quiet hours, away from the pageantry of the court, he was still the man who had been captivated by a woman spinning wool, and she was still the woman who had seen in him the key to her destiny. Then, a shadow fell upon the golden age. The great plague swept in from the east, a tide of death that no army could stop. It took a third of the empire with it. Theodora worked tirelessly, organizing aid, her will a bulwark against the despair. But a different, more personal shadow was gathering around her. In the year 548, the empress fell ill. It was a cancer, a slow, inexorable invasion that the finest physicians in the world were powerless to halt. She faced this final enemy with the same cold courage she had faced the mob, her mind sharp and clear even as her body failed her. Justinian was undone. He, who had commanded armies and rewritten the laws of civilization, was helpless. He spent every moment he could at her bedside, the business of the empire neglected. The loss of her was an unthinkable void, the end of the world in a more profound way than any riot could ever be. He was losing not just his wife, but the very center of his gravity. She died in the summer, her hand in his. The official mourning was immense, a wave of purple and black that swept across the empire. But Justinian's grief was a silent, private ocean. He had lost his Augusta, his partner, his most trusted counselor. He would rule for 17 more years, a long and lonely twilight, but he would never remarry. Her place was eternally vacant. They buried her in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the great mausoleum of emperors. Her sarcophagus of porphyry, the imperial stone, was placed beside those of the great Constantine and his successors. The daughter of a bear keeper now lay in eternal rest among the founders of the empire. Her journey was complete. Centuries passed. The empire she had helped to save eventually crumbled. The great city fell to new conquerors. The Church of the Holy Apostles was torn down, its imperial tombs desecrated and plundered. The golden age of Justinian and Theodora became a distant chapter in a history book, their names whispered by scholars and tourists. Long after, in a time of different empires and different gods, her tomb was found and opened. Those who broke the seal expected to find the last vestiges of imperial grandeur, threads of gold cloth, perhaps a forgotten diadem, jewels that had escaped the notice of earlier looters. They expected to find the symbols of the power she had wielded so ruthlessly. The sarcophagus contained little more than dust and brittle, time-stained bone. But as the light pierced the ancient darkness, it fell upon a small object lying next to the remains of her skull, nestled where her hand might have last rested. It was not a jewel. It was not a golden cross. It was not an imperial seal. It was a small, crudely carved figurine of a bear. It was made of a common wood, its features worn smooth by the passage of 1,000 years and, before that, by the touch of a single hand. It was a worthless, childish thing, an object of no importance to anyone in the world. And yet, it was the only thing she had kept. Through the filth of the theater, through the long journey across the deserts, through the splendor of the palace and the terror of the riots, through her coronation and her long reign, she had kept this one small piece of her first life. The empress who had bathed her throne in blood and remade the laws of the world had gone to her grave clutching a secret reminder. Not of the power she had gained, but of the powerless little girl she had once been, the forgotten daughter of a man who kept the bears for the circus.